My name is Corey Turner. I am a reporter and editor with the NPR education team. I am here very simply because I was interviewing Diane a couple days ago about a big project we're working on school funding. And she said, oh, by the way, when we were all done, she said, we have this new paper coming out on Title I efficiency. You should really come moderate our panel. And luckily, though, it turns out it's a really great paper and has been very helpful. So I hope this is really useful for you all, at least as useful as it was for me. The panelists, very quickly, I know you've got their resumes right here. Carol Johnson, former superintendent of schools in not just Boston or Memphis, but Minneapolis as well. James Cole, I want to make sure I don't screw this up. General Counsel, Delegated Duties of Deputy Secretary, U.S. Department of Ed. And then Richard Murnane, Juliana W., and William Foss Thompson, Research Professor of Education and Society, Harvard Graduate School of Education. And now we have Nora Gordon of Georgetown. And I won't waste much more time. Just want to give us the Cliff's Notes version of Title I flexibility and what might be done to make Title I money a bit more powerful at the local level.
Well, thanks, Corey, and thanks to the Hamilton Project and to all of you for coming to learn about this today. So we'll be talking about Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and going forward, I'll be talking a lot about ESSA, the December reauthorization of ESSA as the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the part of Title I that I'm talking about is really just the money. So this is not about the federal government telling the districts what to do. This is about the federal government providing resources that districts and states have an enormous amount of discretion in deciding how they want to spend them and supporting whatever initiatives that they choose. And so this is about $14 billion. There's two big problems with Title I as I see it. The first is about districts and states, due to the long history of Title I, not fully understanding the great flexibility they now have, and this is even greater under ESSA, to spend the money on what's most important to them rather than spending it on what they think is allowed and what they think is going to pass an audit. The other set of problems is around how the money is distributed and not sufficiently concentrating funds in the neediest places. So I'm going to start with the first one, and here the historical context is critical. Of course, we want districts and states to be able to use the money in the most productive ways. However, going back to 1965, there were no safeguards, and districts and states did very bad things with their Title I money, like build swimming pools instead of helping students in the most disadvantaged schools. And so this led to a bunch of fiscal rules and an audit culture around this. So one of those rules, which has just changed a lot in ESSA, is called supplement, not supplant. And this picture is from a 1978 publication. And this, I think, is so interesting. If you think about the original accountability, the idea was that parents would be this accountability lever, watching the money in their districts, making sure it wound up where it was supposed to go. And the good picture is the top one, where Title I sits on top of the state and local money. That would be supplementing, whereas supplanting, the bad one, is underneath, where Title I is crowding out state and local money, which for sure happened. And so what is critical about this picture is notice it's sitting on top of state and local money. Think revenue, think funds, don't think particular expenditures. And so the test that auditors have been using in recent decades since supplement, not supplant, came into place was really about spending, making sure that the spending was extra. And this was leading to a lot of things that were kind of, as Tony was just describing, around the edges, more after school, more summer, more pull-out instruction, rather than what we now know is so important, focusing on the core. And this is because of this belief that spending on core things would be violating supplement, not supplant. ESSA recognizes this disconnect and has new language that is very explicit about how it's the money that needs to be extra, not the spending. Districts need to give out their state and local money without regard to Title I. and then put the Title I money on top, just like in that picture. And I should also mention we are right now in the midst of negotiated rulemaking on supplement, not supplant, so we may see more specific language coming soon. But in terms of what we need to do to clear up this confusion, we need very clear language coming and regulations and guidance at the federal level, and very importantly from the state level, because the states are those who approve the district's applications for Title I funds. We need to reach beyond the Title I community so that people who don't get paid by Title I know that there's money out there to support work they may want to do in their districts and in their schools. And there's a whole set of policies and practices that have grown up over the decades in state and local education agencies with this old version of compliance in mind. So we need to provide technical assistance to kind of revamp and get ready for this new vision of supplement, not supplant. Next, I want to turn to the formula, and what we have in mind here is the great federal power is redistributing resources across the states. So what we have in mind is that you should be getting on the bottom axis here, we have the share of children who are eligible for Title I. This is essentially the share of kids who are poor in a state. And on the vertical axis, the actual Title I funding per eligible child. This does not look like a uniform distribution, much less like a positive relationship, which you would expect with a progressive system, but actually a negative system where the places that are less poor are getting more money per poor kid. This is not exactly by design. This is what happens when you have 4 different formulas that are very opaque and interact in weird ways when the program is not fully funded and you have an iterative process. So you can have a lot of things in the law that seem like a good idea, but the net result is not a progressive one. So I offer a series of proposals about reforming the formulas, and what that would yield is something that looks more like what you would expect, where states and districts that have more poor kids are getting more money per poor child. So obviously this is a political challenge. The same process that brought us these 4 formulas is not about to roll over. And for this reason, I recommend an independent commission to look at the Title I formulas and make a recommendation that Congress could vote up or down, just like a base closing. So the timing on all of this is critical. ESSA is happening right now. States and districts are rethinking their implementation. They're rethinking a lot of their compliance things, and we need to get this information out to them now. ESSA also specifically mandates IES to study the Title I formulas, and ESSA is on a 4-year reauthorization timeline, so if there is going to be any changes proposed to the formulas, the time to get together and think about what those changes should look like is now. Thanks very much.
All right. So we'll start this off with a few targeted questions to each of you. James, I want to kick off with you. General Counsel, Department of Ed. As Nora said, we're in the middle of a pretty long rulemaking process, so I know there's some things I can't ask you about that we can't talk about. But I am curious, from your experience, what are some of the common misperceptions or misunderstandings around Title I, and what is the Ed Department specifically doing to help state and local education agencies get past those?
Thank you very much for the question, Corey, and thank you very much, Nora, for exploring ways that we can improve Title I funding to get more funding to the students who need it the most. This is a very important topic, and I'm very honored to be a part of the roundtable. My bit of housekeeping was to talk about the fact that we're in negotiated rulemaking, but both Corey and Nora have given you a heads up on that. So unfortunately, I won't be able to engage with you and have the kind of robust back and forth we could have had when they planned this a few months ago, because a good thing happened, which was a new law passed in December. And so now the great news is we are in the middle of negotiated rulemaking. The sessions are open to the public. I encourage you to attend. For more information about the negotiated rulemaking sessions, please visit us on the web at ed.gov. But A lot of great information, and I highly recommend that you read Nora's paper. There's so much to this. This is a very complicated area, and the paper really delves into a lot of detail. We're only going to hit the surface of it here in this short period of time, but I think it's a very worthwhile paper, and really encourage those of you who have not read it to read it. But to address your question, I think the most common misperception that people have is that they don't understand just how much flexibility there is when they operate what we call a school-wide program. And if I step back for a second just to set a little bit of context, there are two types of Title I programs. One is what we call targeted assistance programs, and that's just what it sounds like. You take money and you give it to a certain set of schools or a certain set of students so that you can target the lowest performing students. That's one type of Title I. The second is a school-wide program, and in a school-wide program, you can choose to consolidate, an LEA can choose to consolidate all of their federal money, all of their state money, and all of their local money into one overall pool, can consolidate all of it. And then they can use the funds in this one large overall pool for all of the expenses that the school has, from salaries all the way to technology. So in that way, you've broken down the silos, you've got a bigger pool of money, and a lot of the things Nora talks about in her paper about the great things you can do once you have the money all in one place. The only restrictions that a school has when it comes to a school-wide program and spending those funds are two. One, they have to implement the strategies identified in its comprehensive school-wide plan. So you have to have a plan in order to participate in the school-wide program. And then second, it has to address the intent, and this is key, address the intent of the federal program that provided the funds. For example, a school that consolidates all of the funds generally has to show that it's addressing the needs of its lowest achieving students. That's because that is the purpose of Title I. It also has to address the needs of its English learners because that's the purpose of Title III. And it also has to address in this comprehensive plan the needs of its students with disabilities because that's the purpose of the IDEA. The good news is about 70% of schools have school-wide programs, so that's great news. The bad news is that we do not think many of them understand all the great flexibilities I just talked about a few minutes ago. So why not? What are the barriers to moving forward in this area? The biggest barrier is misinformation. We hear all the time, and Nora's paper points it out, about the fact that practitioners don't really know about all of this flexibility. That's a problem that the Department of Education is aware of. We participate on the ground, and we talk with stakeholders all the time, and we're working really hard to address that. So, for example, last summer, we put out guidance trying to explain these areas, and we're doing everything we can right now to go around the country and make sure people are aware of it. But this is also a problem that auditors and compliance-driven staff at the SEA make a little bit worse, and we don't attribute any nefarious motive or anything like that. It's just that these are folks who like to be able to track funds from top to bottom and to figure out exactly where the funds are going, even though the statute and the regulations don't require it. So most schools are discouraged against funding consolidation because their budget tracking systems are set up to track one by one. This discourages, as you might imagine, schools and Title I administrators from combining funds because they're afraid of what the audit report is going to be. Are they going to flunk the audit report? So what we would encourage, and Nora's paper I think goes to that as well, is to encourage SEAs to encourage the schools to consolidate funds in a school-wide program so that schools can receive the maximum flexibility possible. Really quickly, another misconception is that the use of Title I funds, even in a school-wide program, is more limited than it actually is. So even sometimes people understand there's a school-wide program, I have one, it's more flexible, but they still conceive of it as being more limited than it actually is. The truth is, school-wide programs are not restricted to providing pull-out services. So one of the things people think of in Title I is you pull the kids out, you give them special services to try and address them, and then you put them back into school. Sometimes people think a school-wide program requires that. It does not. It doesn't prohibit it. So if that's what you want to have as part of your school-wide program, you can, but you're not required to do that. So that's more flexibility than a lot of people think they have. A second is they think they have to use the funds for academic subjects only. And again, that's another misconception because Title I can be used to upgrade the entire educational program in a school and serve all students, even if the school does not consolidate Title I with other types of funds. I talked about you could put in Title III, you could put in disability. Even if you don't consolidate that way, you still have the flexibility that I just used. You can use Title I money to improve attendance, improve school climate, counteract bullying, provide positive behavioral interventions, a lot more flexibility. The law also allows schools to use Title I programs in preschool programs. That's another misconception, that you can't use it in preschool. Just last week, I was at Eagle Academy, which is a pre-K through third grade school in Southeast DC, and they're doing great things, and that's a Title I school. In closing, I agree that there's a lot of room for ED to improve its guidance and its outreach, and we're taking steps right now in order to simplify the guidance for SEAs, LEAs, and Title I administrators. The guidance we put out last year is entitled Supporting School Reform by Leveraging Federal Funds in a School-Wide Program. And we put that out in July of 2015 of last year. I highly encourage you guys to review that. The document lays out the benefits of operating a school-wide program, steps to implementation, Title I flexibility, and it also dispels many of the misunderstandings that I've been talking about this morning when you use a school-wide program. Most of the document is going to be very up-to-date and relevant. I do have to point out that we are engaged in rulemaking on supplement, not supplant. So there's a part of that document at the back that you're going to want to make sure you follow our rules to make sure it's still up-to-date. But a good chunk of it is still very important and helpful right now. Our ongoing outreach continues to inform the regulatory and guidance process, and we'll continue to do that. Hearing your comments, concerns is of grave importance to us, especially now, as Nora pointed out, with us being in the rulemaking session. So if you have, when you think about, for example, can we consolidate all of our guidance into one spot? Right now, we have guidance in a number of different places. The more you talk to us, the more you give us comments about that, the more we can take that into account as we do guidance going forward. And also the interplay between the regulations and the rules that we have at the federal level and how they interplay with the rules and regulations at the state level is another thing that we would love to hear more about. So in closing, really excited to be here. This is an extremely important topic and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Carol, I want to pick up on what James just said there at the very end about consolidating guidance, because this seems to come up again and again and again, and certainly, Nora, it's in your paper. In fact, you recommend consolidating all of the disparate federal guidance into one federal document, right? It's just shrinking it down into one place. You can go to one place and answer your questions and figure out, am I at risk of an audit here? Is this truly supplemental? And I'm curious, Carol, because you have so much specific experience within districts, how realistic is that, and what would that mean to schools if they had sort of one-stop shopping when it comes to Title I, yay or nay?
So I wish I could say that all you have to do is create one big document and all the problems would be solved in terms of communicating guidelines. First and foremost, I think that it is very hard to find guidance, and people have to look in too many different places. And that's true for educators. It's even true for our Title I directors. But I don't want a mammoth document that becomes, just unbearable to manage. And so I think that while it's a recommendation of some consolidation, I think it's really important to look at where the regulations sometimes are more or less confusing. So there are, and that can be found by looking at what kind of questions you get. It can be looking at audits. But I think that first and foremost, what I see people get confused about is comparability. There's certain very specific areas of the formula that, or the guidelines that could be refined in ways and put in place in a much more concise and transparent way so that people could understand them and then use them more effectively. I do agree that there are interpretations that make people think that the rules are more restrictive than they are. I think that comes in two ways. People actually do want to make sure at the state and the school district level that the money is going to the students who generated the resources to begin with. And that has not always been the case. And so I think there is some support for trying to do that. As I think Corey mentioned, I worked in Memphis, in Minneapolis, and in Boston. These are in 3 regions of the country. And I would say that Minnesota and Massachusetts, as a matter of record, tend to be more supportive of education in their state and local monies, and some of the revenue that is generated is somewhat based on that. I'll get back to the formula a little bit later. But I think that it is true that what has been really helpful is the school-wide programs. And so I'll give you an example. Like in Boston, of about 135 schools, only about 5 schools in the entire district are not eligible for some Title I services. So in order to be there, you have to have more than 40% of your students eligible for free and reduced lunch. So in other words, only about 5 schools have out of 135. In Memphis, there are about 200 schools. When I was there were maybe 3 schools in the whole district out of 200. So almost all of the Title I schools in those districts are school-wide improvement schools because their poverty rates range anywhere usually from 74 to 80%. And you also have some schools that are 99% poverty. So the truth of the matter is you have lots of schools, as I think was pointed out, 70% of the schools are really school-wide efforts. And so how then do you go about making sure that you give guidance to people so that they can use the money in meaningful ways? And I think that the concern I guess I have maybe about what the technical assistance should look like, not so much from the federal level, because I don't feel like the federal guidance has been as helpful, but
take a note.
But as a urban superintendent, I have relied heavily, I must say, on the Council of Great City Schools, representing the 70th largest districts in the state. They work a lot looking at the policies, and they provide a lot of technical assistance and support to their 70 districts around how to interpret. But I think the most important thing is not about compliance in terms of technical assistance. It's about trying to help people think outside the box, and it's about trying to connect the research that exists with what you might try. So the early childhood research that Harvard did on our pre-K programs was significant, both in selling the board to sustain the expense and trying to really point out why this expense, paid huge dividends. I think the President's Commission on Arts and Humanities identified 8 schools around the country that had used arts to infuse, to do the turnaround strategy. Again, examples. So if I were giving advice to try to help districts, I would assemble some of the research that ties back or try to engage the research community as opposed to just people who would help with technical assistance around fiscal compliance. So I just want to distinguish between technical assistance around fiscal compliance and technical assistance that would support people thinking very differently and also elevate some of the research about what is working around the country, whether it's in some of the turnaround strategies. Vanderbilt just did a study with the Achievement School District. Is trying to connect the research and the practice in ways that would help principals and teachers rethink how they use their resources. Most of the guidance, and here's where I think the federal government could be helpful, most of the guidance is around what not to do, okay? As opposed to giving you a list of, here are a whole bunch of things that are happening around the country. Here's some ideas that are really creative that you could try. Then you could follow up with some of those ideas in terms of how that works. I will say this. I think that being simple, being transparent, we are giving more autonomy and control to site councils at schools. And what's really important is they understand how they got the money, what it's being used for, but all the flexibilities. And so we have to create some mechanisms, I think, within the schools and school districts and state for helping people who have parents and teachers think about more creative ways, especially in an environment where the achievement gap between rich and poor students in the United States is largely, roughly twice the gap between black and white students. So the poverty issues are growing exponentially faster, and those achievement gaps require really intentional and creative strategies, I think, for turning things around. Have I used up my 5 minutes?
I can't read my watch, so.
Okay. Well, let me
safe. Throw in one more idea.
Okay. So I just want to throw in one more idea. This is probably more about the formula, though. So Boston has about 58,000 students. And the Boston census poverty, because it's based on the census, right, is about 28,000 students, right, ages 5 to 17. So think of this. Boston gets about $39 million. And if you extrapolate the 20,000 students, it's about $1,900 a pupil. And the budget overall in Boston is about $1.2 billion. Okay, so you've got $39 million of it coming from Title I, but you got a budget of $1.2 billion and $1,900 roughly. Then you've got Memphis, over 100,000 pupils, right? About 55,000 of them are categorized in the poverty census data. And they get close to $70 million, but their unit amount is about $1,200. And then you go to Minneapolis with about 36,000 students, and the census in poverty is about 14,000 students. They get about $22 million, and their roughly is about $1,600. So it's not the same, but it's not the same for a number of factors. We've created incentives in a way, so we have to get the incentive structures right. For if a state invests more, then there is a commensurate amount of, am I saying this wrong? You're looking.
You're correct. I disagree with the incentive, but not with the way you're describing it.
We started the round table.
Yeah, we started the round
Okay,
table.
sorry.
Hold on. So let's keep that thought, because I do actually want to get to that. I want to get to Dick here for one.
Well, I just want to say, just let me close out
Sure.
this thought. What we don't want to do as we redistribute, we want to get the incentives right so that people don't invest less. And there are states who really are not investing very much. They probably have more poor kids and deserve to have more money. But we have to be careful that we don't create an incentive structure that alters the field of contribution. That's all I want to say.
Dick, I want to go to you for a broad view, if you don't mind. Title I's been with us for, what, half a century. Programs changed a lot. Our schools have changed a lot. The kids we're educating have changed a lot. What's different today? What's in terms of how we should understand Title I and how to make Title I more efficient and more effective?
I think there's a number of things that have changed that are really important. First is the American economy has changed in a fundamental way, in ways that mean that the consequences of leaving school without a strong set of skills are much greater today than they were in 1965. So I think that so that's the kind of the first point. The second is, as a number of people have mentioned, most states now have quite good standards for what kids need to know at each grade level in at least English language arts and mathematics. That's important because educators and surveys of classroom teachers indicate they support having clear standards. They are terrified of having being held accountable for them before they know how to do that work. But they support the standards, and they do increase clarity on what you want all children to learn. Third is that I don't think test-based accountability is going away. Under the new law, it's still the case that schools, that school districts and states have to report what percentage of students in each school by subgroup are scoring at proficient levels on reading and math tests. That puts enormous pressure on school principals and superintendents in high-poverty districts to improve kids' scores. So we don't need the kind of the input-based accountability that, as Bobby Kennedy rightly argued in the late 1960s, was important then. A fourth thing is we know much more about what it takes to improve schools, particularly schools that serve high percentages of poor kids than we did 50 years ago. We know in particular it takes three things. It requires a strategy to relentlessly focus on improving the quality, consistency, and coherency of instruction. And I think we often don't recognize enough although Tony's work emphasizes it in a central way, this is a school-wide phenomenon. And just one example, one of the things that is emphasized in Common Core English Language Arts standards is being able to read text closely and annotate text. Well, you need to do that in science and math and social studies classes as well as in English classes. Well, if each classroom teacher has her own way of doing that, it's not going to catch with kids. On the other hand, if the school has developed a common set of language, a common strategy, and that's reinforced every day in every class, kids are much more likely to get that. But that, again, requires a school-wide focus. So a school-wide focus on improving instruction, making it more coherent. Second, tracking the skill progress of every child in great detail regularly. And then third, having in place a set of strategies to intervene quickly and intensively when children fall behind. And we're going to hear about some possible strategies in subsequent panels. So those are all elements of a school-wide strategy, and I think in that supports, as Nora has said, the emphasis in the new law in supporting school-wide use of Title I money. But of course, we also know that that's tough to do. Just one example is not mentioned in Nora's terrific paper, but it's not only getting down to the school district level, it's below that too. I sat in last year in a number of meetings that school principals in Boston have with central office staff on budgets. And I heard staff from the same office, same central office staff responsible for categorical programs provide different guidance about what schools could do and could not do with categorical grant money. That same district, same office. Now, again, part of the explanation is different degrees of staff, of experience and expertise, not so clear state regulations, but this problem that Nora described is enormous. Now, she and the other speakers had a number of ideas on how to improve guidance and outreach. One thing I would suggest is thinking about that as a research problem, an evaluation problem. If the federal, there are advertising firms and public relation firms that evaluate all the time whether their strategies of getting the message out are effective. I think it's a real problem for the federal government. What should it do to have an impact on the guidance that school district Title I folk give to individual school principals and how that affects what they do. It's a tough problem because there's many layers. But it seems to me one could think of evaluating a number of possible strategies. Last point one disturbing pattern is an increasing concentration of poor kids in schools in which their classmates are also poor kids. Well documented. Now, what are the consequences of that for Title I? Well, as Nora pointed out, if that concentration is going to continue to increase in this country, and there's no reason to believe it's not, then greater concentration of funds makes sense. Very difficult politically to change. So one thing we might think about is, what are actions of the federal government in different branches that have played a role in leading to this increasing concentration? Some of it has been housing policies. Some of them have been Supreme Court decisions over the last 45 years. Should we take those as given? Should we take as given that the poorest kids in the country have to go to school together? So I would just leave you with that thought.
Nora, I want to ask you about when I first saw the paper, the thing that caught my attention, first and foremost, and I was just looking at it last night, and I just couldn't get my head around it, and I saw it up here, the spray chart, that to my mind works in the exact opposite direction that anyone who understands very little about Title I would assume that it works, which is to say that the state that has the largest concentration of low-income kids also happens to receive the lowest rate of per-child funding through Title I. And you saw the states at the top that were receiving a heck of a lot more money per child than Mississippi were the Dakotas, I think New Hampshire, Vermont. Number one, can you just go into a little more detail into how that's possible? And number two, what of your policy prescriptions will help flip that script?
Thanks. The mic good? Okay, thanks. So as I mentioned, there are 4 different formulas in Title I. There's a basic grant, which is giving relatively uniform amount per pupil, and in each state, the amount you get per eligible pupil is determined by the average level of spending per pupil, excluding federal funds, in your state. And so this is what Carol was talking about when she said we want to make sure we don't allow states to roll back on their efforts, because as it stands, the current formula, if they did so under the current formula, they know they would lose federal funds, and so that could provide an incentive for them to maintain funding. The number that goes into that, though, comes from not only funds from the state, but also from local funds. And so the reason why Mississippi is getting so little money per poor pupil is because they're spending very little money per pupil. And so you could think, well, if you're in a state that has some very poor districts and also a bunch of rich districts who are spending a lot locally, that's going into that adjustment per pupil. And so you're benefiting and getting more money in Title I because you happen to have those districts in your state driving up that state average. So that's one bigger, and that adjustment goes on with all of the 4 formulas. The other 3 formulas are basically ways of putting additional weights on students depending on the characteristics of the districts that they live in. And the thing that makes the state level graph look the weirdest is the small state minimum, which applies to each of the 4 formulas, basically guaranteeing each state, regardless of how many poor census children it has in it, to get at least some minimum slice of the total pie. And so that is what's making those outliers with the Dakotas and Vermont and New Hampshire, getting so much money per poor pupil. I will emphasize, though, those states don't have a lot of poor kids. That's not sucking up most of the pie. And so if you wanted to see a real change in the relationship, I think it's an important thing to reform, because it makes it difficult to figure out how much money you're going to get, and this idea of you should know how much money you're going to get. The program's not fully funded. And so you give out the money. The law says fund at 40% of this average state level per pupil. We're nowhere near that. And so you give out the money, and then you have to take off the top from everybody to bring the small states up to their minimum. You also have to take off the top to bring districts that might be losing money based on demographic changes up to their hold harmless amounts. And this iterative process makes it very difficult to know what you're going to be getting in the future, and I think difficult for lawmakers to understand. I mean, in ESSA, it's right in the text of the statute. It says it's hard to understand the distributional implications of Title I. IES, please explain it.
Yeah, Carol, you look like.
Well, I was going to say that I think that back in the 1970s, as Dick mentioned, there were bigger differences between within state districts, right? So since that time, there have been a lot of court-ordered and finance reform lawsuits that have created less difference within the states, but more differences across states. So that's the first point. So like within the state, they've had to do more equalization across districts within the state. Secondly, I think I just want to say that I think that while I applaud the recommendation about the small state minimum, it's such a minimum amount of money in the big scope of the world that I question which battles you want to fight hardest. So there are political allies and political consequences because, as is true in Boston or Minneapolis, the clout of some voices and the marginalization of others is consequential. So I'm not saying we shouldn't relook at the formula. I'm only saying that if I had a choice of which battle to fight, the small state minimum is such And you point out,
yes,
compared to, let's say, the whole harmless provisions. And let me just play it a little bit out. So I'm in Boston. I have 2 high schools. I noticed that one is getting $500,000 more than the other one, and I can't explain it. So I look back across the system, and I realize of my 135 schools, there are a lot of schools I can't explain the formula for. So we go through this whole process of creating a weighted student formula. We have a big committee of 60 people. Everybody gives us their input. There are going to be winners and losers, right? And so we introduce it to the principals and the parents, and we tell everybody we're going to a weighted student formula. But as Nora points out, we have this provision where we hold you harmless. Well, we tell people you're going to be held harmless, but only for 2 years. And over that time, we call it soft landing. We'll give you a soft landing. We're going to phase you in. But eventually, here's how much money you're going to get because here are the kids you have. And we had weighted factors, poverty, ELL. Boston and Minneapolis have huge ELL populations. And so we tried to put it in place. We did all the, I had a parent come to a board meeting, a father. He says, it is so transparent. I totally get it. I see what you're doing. It is very fair. I don't like it because my kids are losing money at my school, so I'm against it. So, like, even when people know that it's fair, it's more transparent, it's like they can explain it in a PTA meeting to other parents, how they get the money they got, why they got it. Now, it did do one other thing, though. Some of my schools that sometimes seem to be resistant to some kinds of kids, because our high schools are open enrollment, right? You can go anywhere. They became so welcoming of my poorest kids. They would come and say, I thought I couldn't take any more kids. I bet I can take 50 more. Because I know you're closing school A, B, or C. So, it is true that leveraging resources can have a potentially advantage to getting a more equitable system. But I do want to emphasize that the reason the formula is the way it is because to get political allies, and that's why the formula didn't change in this last iteration, too. And the last thing I want to say is this, that just like statewide test scores mask the aggregate test scores of a state, mask the performance of some of your lowest performing school districts in the state. When you calculate the formula just based on the state, it masks the implications of the formula sometimes for the poorest and urban districts. And so it's not enough to disaggregate and analyze the data on a state basis. You have to actually look at the state and see the impact on Boston and Springfield. You can't just say, well, here's how it's going to be distributed. Because I've looked at some of the runs on another analysis, and a lot of the urban districts lose, and again, I'm speaking from an urban district perspective, lose revenue even when you think you're trying to advantage them in the formula. You actually have to run the numbers.
The one thing, if I could add just really quickly and briefly, I think the discussion we've just heard gives you an idea of how complicated this is, and what the panelists have said is that ESSA, the new law, did not change the formula. It did direct a division within the Department of Education to study it, and we are going to do that, and also issue a report, and so a report to Congress. So we will be looking into this, but it is quite a complicated thing, but just wanted to leave you with that there is more work to be done on.
And I don't want to sound like I'm against her. I think this is great, but I just am pointing out the
thank you. And can I respond briefly to the small state minimum? I absolutely agree with you. It's not a lot of money. It's not going to help the Mississippis that much to get rid of it. The big problem I see with the small state minimum is that it makes it impossible to, and hold harmless, the two of them together make it impossible to figure out the distributional implications of the other four formulas. And so it gets into this winners and losers mentality where you have to see the runs to see what's going to happen to your state and your districts. And it becomes very difficult to explain why is it, bad to have certain things that might seem reasonable in the formula. But I would be not at all averse to saying, let's have some other pot of money separate from Title I. Let's say we want to have a rural schools initiative, and we're going to put some money in that. If you think there's a particular problem that the small state minimum was meant to solve, other than, or even not a particular problem, just a political problem, But.
Well, I do know that these pieces are interrelated, right? So I think what you're pointing out is when you, in a finite pot of money, right, when you shift one thing, it does impact other shifts. And so in order to get a more holistic approach, you took all of the formula, all four.
Need to go to audience Q&A. First question comes out of something you said earlier, Carol, and I guess this should go to James first, or we can open it up, whoever wants to contribute here. In giving federal guidance, are there actual restrictions on affirmatively recommending strategies rather than simply restricting uses? Can you include best practices or sort of template programs that we know work or have evidence to suggest they work?
One of the things we do, and I'm going to be interested to hear my panelists, one of the things we do when we put out guidance is often use examples, and that's one way to do it, to make it clear, so there isn't an incredible restriction against it. The question becomes, how can we discuss it in a way that's going to be most helpful to 50 different states with 50 different sets of requirements? We have to be mindful around the federal role in getting into states' abilities to set requirements. We have to think about how the 50 different states communicate their guidance down, which is also complicated. And so we have to think about all of that as we think about how to do examples, as we think about how to put forth best practices, which may or may not be applicable in certain ways. So I think one of the things that's very helpful will be during the rulemaking process that we hear more about what can be helpful as we think through how best to move forward in an area where states have a lot of flexibility.
I do hope you will read Nora's paper, but one thing that she points out that I thought, there were a couple of really good ideas around this topic. One was creating transparency around the communications that get sent out. So if one state asks a question, having the ability to, with a database, to research how many people ask this question about resources to private schools, for example. And so if several states, obviously there may be some variations, but having those examples online in a retrievable system would, I think, help without worrying about what is the 50-state challenge. But if you had that pretty transparently. Now, I would hope that then the people at the federal level won't be reluctant to put in writing their answers to the questions because it's going to be retrieved by multiple states. But that would be the only cautionary note I would note, but I think that's a really good idea. And again, her notion about having a single document, or at least a place where you can find everything, both of those, I think, could help, especially if they were enhanced by, here's some positive things, not just what you can't do, but what you can do.
Got another question for Dick or Nora. What are the best new policy levers in the ESSA for serving ELL, students with disabilities, low-income kids, especially when it comes to parental engagement or accountability?
Okay. I think we'll see what happens with the rulemaking, but I think it might be, with regards to Title I anyway, thinking about this new definition of supplement, not supplant. And it's not saying these are the 3 new policy levers available to you. Rather, it's saying, here's this money, go spend it on what you want to spend it on. But this is whatever compliance setup you have around IDEA would be separate and still freestanding.
Just one addition. One, and again, Carol can speak to this better than I, but in Boston, where I spent a fair amount of time, a couple year part, you find that in many schools, a high percentage of the kids that are eligible for Title I, they're also English language learners, and they also are eligible for special education. each of these categorical programs has its own regulations. So one of the things my understanding is they've done in Boston is that they want new teachers to be certified to be special education teachers and teachers of English language learners, because otherwise it just makes the staffing at the school level phenomenally difficult. Now, I think anything that could bring coherence among these programs and the regulations would be helpful to an awful lot of school principals serving in these particularly challenging schools.
I want to ask you one more question, Dick. Coming out of what Carol said earlier about picking your fight when it comes to making Title I more efficient. I mean, there are lots of things in Nora's paper, lots of suggestions, recommendations. If you had to pick your battle, what's the one thing that you would do to try to reform Title I to make it more effective?
Well, I think, and this is not really a battle, is it, Dora? I mean, I think you point out so eloquently in the paper, the law now provides, and James said as well, for quite potentially powerful uses of the Title I money. The trouble is that message is not getting down to the almost 100,000 schools that get Title I money, and so how to change that is a fundamental challenge.
I feel like the more people I talk to about that, they say it's a mindset
It's clarity
problem.
and
It's not just another document, it's a mindset change.
People have been working in this program for decades. You have program officers, in districts, Title I directors, that's been their entire career. They've been a Title I employee, and they don't view it as they are preventing flexibility. They view it as they are protecting this money for the intent of the program.
And it's audit aversion.
Mm-hmm. I think there is one provision in the new law that has the 50 pilot sites.
Yes, around the revenue,
yeah.
Exactly, around the revenue. So there is a pilot provision that allows states to look at it from a different perspective. I can't say much more than that, but there is a provision that allows us to regulate and to go forward in that area, and I think Nora's paper talks about that as a way to move forward as well.
Dick, last thought?
One issue that has not come up that, again, is that my understanding is when you try and figure out how much money is going to each school per student, the challenge is how do you deal with teacher salaries? Schools that serve primarily middle-class populations tend to have much more experienced teachers. They get paid more. Well, school districts have fudged on this in terms of whether you count the actual salaries going to that school as part of what they get or only the average salary. That, I think, is a huge policy issue going forward.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think we have to wrap up, but thank you, all of you. That was great.
Nice to meet you.